Dr. Allitt was born and raised in England. He was an undergraduate at Oxford University, and then he went on to study for his Ph.D. in American history at the University of California, Berkeley. He's been professor of American history at Emory University here in Atlanta since 1988. And he teaches American foreign policy, Industrial Revolution, environmental history, and the American Revolution as well. He's the author of 7 books and the presenter of a 12-video series with the great courses, and the most recent of which was How Railways Transformed the World. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Allitt to Georgia.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. One of the strange aspects of my life is that my job is to teach American history to American students. And so when we get to especially events like the American Revolution, which I'll be talking about today, they wonder whether it's possible for me to be objective. Well, you'll have to judge that for yourselves as I talk to you today about the King of England at the time of the Revolution and the English view of the American Revolution. So the first thing to think about is this, that every nation remembers its successes and forgets about its failures. So if you're American, which I expect everyone here is today, the dates you remember are things like the battles of Lexington and Concord from 1775, the Declaration of Independence the next year, whose 250th anniversary we're celebrating this year. The first time the Americans won a real battlefield victory, which was Saratoga in 1777. The Battle of Yorktown, the really decisive victory for Washington's army in 81. The Treaty of Paris, by which Britain agreed to the idea of American independence. And then the writing of the Constitution in 1788. And in fact, we'll be doing the 250th of all those events over the next decade or so. But then if you're English, this is what you remember. The Battle of Quebec, from 1776. This was when the Americans launched an expedition to try and capture Canada, and it failed because the people there, the British garrison there, repelled them. The capture of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. The failure of an attempt by France and Spain to conquer England in 1779, almost as dramatic as the Spanish Armada of 1588. The Battle of Jersey, the Battle of the Saints, and the Siege of Gibraltar. Now, unless you know really a lot about history, the chances are you've never even heard of any of those events before. But that's because these are the things which Britain thinks about when it thinks about the 1770s and 80s, as opposed to the list of things I showed you before. All right, now let's move on now to the Declaration of Independence. There's Thomas Jefferson on the right, the man who actually drafted it. And if you look at obviously it's too small for you to be able to read the text, but you can see that there's a lot of very short paragraphs there. Usually they're just one sentence long. Okay, here's a few of them. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then Jefferson goes on to list all the things that he says the King of England has done. He's refused to assent to laws. He's made his judges dependent on his will alone. He's erected a multitude of new offices. He's plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. And he ends up, this is in 1776, he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. In other words, who's the very worst person who's ever lived? George III. Right? Well, was he really like that? My answer is that he was not, in fact, like that at all. He was, and in fact, what's so amazing about George III is how much better he was than most of his predecessors and many of his successors on the throne of England. Of course, you might say that's an argument against having a monarchy. So what I'd like to do next is give you a little summary history of what had been happening with the British kings and queens in the foregoing 150 years. And the place to start is back in the 1630s with King Charles I. This is the king whose policies prompted a lot of English Puritans to leave and come to America. And the child at his feet there, you can see on the left, is the one who later on was going to be King Charles II. And the other one, the one being held by his wife, is the one who later on was going to be King James II. Now, the thing about Charles I is that he thought that he was king by divine right. He thought that God had said to him, "You are the king, and no one else can tell you what to do." Although he took advice from others, he was certain about the idea that he was a divinely approved absolute monarch. And when Parliament challenged his claim, a degenerating series of arguments eventually led to a civil war in England in the 1640s. The king lost, and the leader of the parliamentary forces, Oliver Cromwell, put him on trial, condemned him to death, and he was executed in Whitehall. If you go to London and walk from Trafalgar Square down towards the Houses of Parliament, you'll pass the place where King Charles I was executed in public. And then Britain briefly became what we would call a military dictatorship under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the army and one of the leaders of Parliament. But when he died, it was impossible for Britain to find a replacement. And so the English aristocracy, with great anxiety, invited back one of the two little boys I showed you before, the man who became King Charles II. And think what it must have been like to be Charles II. Again, he was nominally in control, but he couldn't help remembering what had happened to his father. And of course, that had a very sobering effect on his conduct. He was married to a Portuguese princess called Catherine of Braganza. He had 14 children, but none of them were hers. He's probably the most promiscuous king in English history. When he died, he was succeeded by his brother, James II. And this is the other baby I showed you, the one whose mother was holding him in the white clothes. Now, England's had some very bad kings, and I think that James II was downright the worst. That's saying something, and nevertheless it's true. He was the person who, before he became king, his name was the Duke of York. And do you all know the song, The Grand Old Duke of York? Yeah, it's about him. And he's the person who New York City is named after. It used to be New Amsterdam, and he was the leader of the military expedition which seized it from the Dutch and turned it into an English colony, and it was named after him, New York. He, in the course of his 4 years as king, 1685 to 1688, he alienated the support of everybody whose help he needed, with the result that he then had to flee from England and go into exile in France. And at that point, Parliament invited a new king to come to England. And here's a scene of the new king that Parliament has invited coming ashore on a ship from Holland. That's the Dutch flag flying on the mast of the ship there. And this new king was King William III, who's the only person ever to be a joint ruler with his own wife. We've only once had a king and queen who are co-equals, William III and Mary II. You all know about a college in Virginia called William and Mary? It's named after them, and it was founded, they were the king and queen. Now, these are all events that back in the 1770s, Americans would be familiar with all this history, the colonists. And when they rebelled against Britain, they quoted as their right to do so the fact that Britain had also revolted against their king, James II, back in 1688. One of the things that Parliament did was to say, from now on, the monarch's power is limited. And one of the ways in which it's limited is by the Bill of Rights. And again, if you look at the English Bill of Rights from 1689 and the American Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, you'll be very struck by how similar they are. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to trial by jury, habeas corpus, and so on. And so the memory of this whole event, 1688 to 9 in England, is called the Glorious Revolution. That's how it's remembered, because there was no bloodshed, the wicked old king fled, and a far better one took his place. Oh, here we are, yes. So from now on, Britain was a constitutional monarchy, meaning that it still had a king, and the king still had a lot of authority and influence. But now supreme power rested in Parliament, because it was Parliament which had said, we're not going to accept the old king, and instead we're going to bring in the new one. So from then right up to the present, Britain has been a constitutional monarchy. And so the way in which British people have spoken about it for the last 300 years is as the king in, well, you know, where does supreme power lie? It lies with the king in Parliament. Now, one of the things that makes it complicated is that one of the things that made James II so unacceptable was the fact that he was a Catholic. Now, obviously, today we're familiar with the idea that mutual religious respect is a good thing. But back in the late 1600s, to be a Catholic in England was to be vulnerable to the accusation of treason, because the French and the Spanish, England's classic enemies, were Catholic powers. And so the belief was, if you're a Catholic, you're really sympathetic to the enemy. And so one of the things that Parliament did in 1701 was to write what was called the Act of Settlement. And it said from now on, the king or queen must always be a Protestant, must be one of the Protestant churches. You know, no more Catholic monarchs. Now, it didn't look as though that was going to be a problem, the succession, because Queen Anne, who succeeded to William and Mary after they had both died, had got 14 children, but they all died before she did. One of the things that's so miserable about really life before the 20th century is the incredibly high infant mortality rate and the very, very high rate of mothers dying in childbirth. And Queen Anne herself survived, but all her children died. The one which lived the longest only made it to the age of 11. So when she died in 1714, Britain had to invoke the Act of Settlement, which they'd passed in 1701. And what it said was, the next king has got to be related in some degree to the previous royal family, but they've got to be a Protestant. Well, the closest one they could find was King George I. He was then Prince George, the Elector of Hanover. This was a minor princedom in Germany. And to his own amazement, he became King of England. He couldn't speak English. He wasn't literate. Apparently, he used to go to, you know how in those days, kids in school would have a slate, and they'd write on the slate with a piece of chalk. Okay, when he went to bed, King George I would take his slate and practice writing his words. But he only ever learned a few words of English. He spent a lot of his time in his German principality. He was widely hated and despised by the English people. And yet, they said, at least he's a Protestant. It's the one thing that really counted. He was succeeded by his son. It was King George II. And George II's famous for being the very last king of England to actually lead his army into battle. This was at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, when he literally led the way. But he'd been born back in 1683. He'd grown up in Germany. He spent a lot of time in Germany. He never really mastered the English language. His son, Prince Frederick, died when his father was still alive, with the result that when he finally died in 1760, he was succeeded by George III, born and raised in England, a real English king. And this was the first time for more than a century that Britain had had an indigenous king, somebody who actually came from England. And he was 22 years old when he came to the throne. He was young, fit, handsome, intelligent, hardworking. What happened about 2005 is that Queen Elizabeth II opened the archives at Windsor Castle, and it became possible to read masses of papers related to George III, which until then had been sequestered. And one of the things that they found was all the papers he wrote as a schoolboy and how good they were. When he was king, he worked hard every day. He spent 12 hours a day at his desk dealing with national affairs. And not only did he date everything, he even put the time. So when he finished a letter, it would say, June the 15th, 1763, 8:04 p.m. So we know almost to the minute what he was doing. And there are literally these documents from every day of his life way back then. Now, what do you think was the most important consideration for him when he took a wife? Protestant. To be a Protestant, exactly. The place to find Protestant princesses was in the German states. And so he went to Mecklenburg and met and found Princess Charlotte, or at least his advisors did. And so the agreement was made, this is the one he's going to marry. He never met her till his wedding day. She came ashore from the boat, they were introduced, and about 2 hours later, they got married. And yet, it turned out to be a very happy and very successful marriage. In the end, they had 15 children. 15 children, that's right. And here's a painting, a lovely painting. They're all wearing their silks, and obviously, and the artist has really given you the feeling of the shimmer of the silk. Isn't that lovely? And and also, unlike his predecessors, as far as you know, he was completely faithful to her. Yeah, he didn't have a great string of mistresses like most of his predecessors had. He was a good family man. Yeah. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that he's without faults, but nevertheless, he's got these very interesting qualities. In 1770, he appointed as his prime minister Lord North. And Lord North was a funny, witty, very intelligent man, but a hardliner when it came to American affairs. And Lord North, as prime minister, would sometimes 3 times a year, he'd send a letter to the king saying, "Your Majesty, I'm completely unsuitable to this job. I wish you'd let me retire." And the king would write back and say, "You can't let me down. I've got to have you. None of my other ministers is suitable or adequate. What would it take to keep you?" And Lord North would say, "Well, I'm very seriously in debt, actually." And the king would say, "That's all right. I'll pay off all your debts. And in addition, I'll give you an income of £20,000 a year." So the king made him rich by keeping him on as prime minister. All right. Now, a very interesting thing happened in the English courts in 1772. An American called Stuart came ashore in England, bringing his slave with him, and the slave was called Somerset. A group of English, this is just at the very beginning of the abolitionist movement, with people in England, particularly Quakers, saying, slavery is wrong. Slavery is a moral wrong. We've got to stop it. So a group of Quaker abolitionists kidnapped, in effect, Somerset, the slave, and then on his behalf sued for his freedom, saying there's no slavery in England. And the Lord Chief Justice of England, a man called Lord Mansfield, in a very famous decision, the Somerset case of 1772, agreed and set the slave free. So the moment he set foot on England, he became a free man. There's no slavery here in England. Now, that had really volcanic consequences, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic, because the American slave owners suddenly said, does this mean Britain is going to abolish slavery? I mean, one of the reasons that the leaders of Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia were enthusiastic for the revolution was because they were afraid that otherwise slavery might be abolished because of the precedent of the Somerset case. Now, interestingly, living at the house of Lord Mansfield were these 2 young ladies, Dido Bell and Lady Elizabeth Murray. They were both illegitimate, and they were both the daughters of some of Lord Mansfield's relatives who'd been in the West Indies. One of them had had an affair with a white woman, which was why Lady Elizabeth Murray was the result. And the other one had an affair with a black woman, which is where Dido Bell came from. But they were brought up together as young English ladies in the 1760s and 70s, showing that Lord Mansfield had very advanced ideas about race for his time. Now, one of the famous Englishmen of the early 1770s was Samuel Johnson. He's really the first person to write a decent dictionary. Unbelievable knowledge-devouring capacity that Johnson had. And here's what he said about the growing dissatisfaction in America, the turbulence which led up to the American Revolution. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? In other words, he skewered the Americans on the point that, on the one hand, they claimed they were being enslaved by British policy, but actually they were the ones who were doing the enslaving. Yeah. So, and of course, this was a point which the British reiterated all the way through the period of the American Revolution. Now, another very interesting person living at the time was Edmund Burke. And do you remember when you studied high school history, you hear about how the Americans said at the Stamp Act crisis, we want, no taxation without representation. Yeah, we want to be represented. All right. And to which the British said, well, it's true you don't have representatives in Parliament, but what you have got is virtual representation. The people who are in Parliament understand who you are, understand what you're doing. They're aware of the problems you're confronting. Now, from an American point of view, that's usually dismissed as not a very serious argument. But interestingly, Edmund Burke made exactly the same argument to the members of his own constituency in Britain, in Bristol. And he said to them, this is during an election campaign, he said, if you want to vote for me, I hope you will. But when I go to Parliament, I'm not just going to be a representative of your interests. Because once I enter Parliament, that's a body which deals with the whole of the British Empire. And sometimes your interests are going to contradict the greater interests of the empire. Yeah. So in other words, I'm not going to regard myself solely as your delegate. There are more important things in the world. So he was making the argument in favor of the idea of virtual representation. Now, when the Revolutionary War actually broke out, the man whom the British put in charge of their military was General William Howe. And the man in charge of the Royal Navy at the same time, the British Navy, was his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. They were both members of Parliament. The general was in the House of Commons and the admiral was in the House of Lords. And they'd both spoken out against the stupidity of British policy towards America. So it's kind of amazing that they were the ones who were chosen to carry it out. And they were given a double command. On the one hand, they were the leaders of the military forces. But on the other hand, they were also given the job of conciliating the colonies if they could, finding a way of preventing the American rebellion and restoring harmony. There's a famous story about how General Howe, the army one, sent a letter to George Washington to say, we need to get together and talk about these issues rather than shedding blood. And he addressed the letter to George Washington, Esquire. And Washington looked at the envelope and sent it back saying, I'm not George Washington, Esquire. I'm His Excellency, the Commander of the Continental Army. And until he recognizes that, I'm not even going to speak to him. So anyway, finally they got together. But Howe and his brother said, His Majesty the King offers you pardons for your rebellion. To which Washington answered, I've got nothing to be ashamed of. You're the ones who've got something to be ashamed of, and absolutely rejected the idea. And then, of course, it came to blows. Now, one of the great surprises of the American Revolutionary War is that the colonists won. How could that possibly happen? You probably remember the Americans asking the same question in Vietnam. How can we possibly not win? And yet somehow they didn't. Now, the first real hammer blow came at Saratoga in 1777, when a British army coming south down the Hudson River was cut off from its supplies and wasn't properly reinforced, with the result that an American army led by General Horatio Gates surrounded them and outnumbered them and forced them to capitulate. They'd literally got no food left, and so they were forced into submission. Their leader was General John Burgoyne, and he became the scapegoat for the failure of this British policy, although there's quite a lot of doubt about whether it was really his fault. Now, the Battle of Saratoga had really huge consequences because it said to the French government, look at this, the Americans might actually win. Ever since the war began, the Americans had had diplomats in France, most famously Benjamin Franklin, trying to persuade the French government to come into the war on the American side. But the French government said, let's wait and see whether the Americans can win a victory, because we don't really want to support a rebellion only it wants to see it fail, which at first they thought it could very easily do. And so this was the event which brought in the French. And of course, once France was involved in the war, Britain at once had to start worrying not just about what was happening in America, but what was happening back in Europe, because there's only 20 miles between Britain and France at their narrowest place. Now the possibility of a French invasion of England becomes a danger. So Britain could no longer concentrate all its forces in America as it had done for the first 2 years of the war. Here's a lovely French cartoon from this period. And it's making fun of the British Prime Minister, Lord North, and his wife. Look at her hairstyle, first of all. This is a time of very elaborate hairstyles. And so in her hair, she's got a fortress with a cannon that's firing. It says, the writing is probably too small for you to read, but it says, "My Lord North, the fall of Grenada, one of the French sugar islands, has made me feel very sick." And on the left there, this is Britannia, who's the female personification of Britain. And you can see that she's put down her shield and she's feeling very sorry about what's going on. So it's a French cartoon making fun of the British defeats in the war. Even more staggering from the British point of view was their defeat at Yorktown in 1781, which showed just how important French help had been. Because now, Yorktown, which of you has been to Yorktown? Okay, great. I hope the rest of you will get the chance to go. It's fascinating to see. The only way to get to Yorktown by water is to go up the Chesapeake Bay. But the French Navy was blockading the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, so the British ships bringing supplies and relief couldn't get there. And the army at Yorktown was half the Continental Army under George Washington and half the French army under Rochambeau. And together they overwhelmed the British force that was defending the town, and it was forced to surrender. And that's the painting by John Trumbull, which commemorates that moment, with the Americans on the right, the French on the left, and the British walking between them, with General Washington here in the background. Now, the leader of the English at Yorktown was General Cornwallis. But the British government, when it investigated this defeat, said, Cornwallis is not to blame. He was in a situation where he couldn't possibly have prevailed. And so he wasn't disgraced by this defeat. And in fact, he went on to a very, very prominent career in other parts of the British Empire. For example, here's a picture of Cornwallis here, and he's accepting the surrender of an Indian prince. This is the time when the British Empire was gradually extending its reach over India. And Cornwallis was a very, very effective soldier for the British in dominating India. You can see the elephants there. So here's a book called Losing America, Conquering India. It's a biography, a sort of military biography of Cornwallis. And on the right there is the grave of General Cornwallis. It's in India. So a great big mausoleum was built to him, and he was regarded as one of the central figures of heroic British achievements in British India. I mentioned this at the beginning in my list of mysterious events that you'd never heard of, the capture of St. Lucia. Now, when the revolution began, I mean, the way we study the American Revolution, we always think about the 13 colonies, don't we? But from Britain's point of view, there weren't 13 colonies, there were 26, including Newfoundland, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on. In other words, the mainland, the Canadian provinces, and the Sugar Islands. It was a great disappointment to the Americans that the Caribbean islands didn't join in with the revolution. That's what they would have liked. But they didn't, mainly because the whites were terrified about slave rebellions. Anyway, St. Lucia was one of the French islands, and it was seized by the British in 1778. And the great Navy hero of the British war of the 1770s and 80s was Admiral Rodney. And again, it's quite likely that you've never heard of him because he's a big name in English history, but not at all in American history because he was fighting on the wrong side. He won a terrific naval victory over the French fleet at the Battle of the Saints in 1782. And by doing so, reasserted British Navy dominance of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, or should I call it the Gulf of America? At this big sea battle, 3 of the English captains were killed. And if you go to Westminster Abbey in England, which again, I'm sure some of you have done, one of the monuments you pass is the 3 captains monument. So this is a memorial to the 3 English sea captains who were killed at the Battle of the Saints in 1782, Captains Bain, Blair, and Manners. And so here are the 3 captains. This is Neptune, the god of the sea, and he's pointing to them to say what marvelous people they were. This is Britannia, who I showed you before when she was slumped over in the French cartoon. So here she is, and then she's supported by the British lion, which plays the same role in English iconography that the eagle plays. You know, it's the sort of national emblem, animal emblem. If you go to Wales in the northwest, west of England, you'll find the Rodney Monument, which was built as soon as news of this great battle came in. So it's still there from 1782. And when the Admiral finally died, he was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral. Westminster Abbey was full up of monuments by about 1790. And so from then on, the slightly more recent ones are in St. Paul's, which is another wonderful place to visit. And you can see here again that these chiseled stone maidens are gesturing to Rodney as the last word in military success. And finally, if you go to Jamaica, one of the big British colonies at the time, there's the Rodney Monument in Jamaica. And so all over Britain and all over what used to be the British colonies, you find things named after him. He's as famous in British history as Douglas MacArthur or Dwight Eisenhower is in American history, a great military hero. Now, another British military success of the time was its defense of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is a place, it's at the very, very southwestern tip of Spain, and it dominates the narrow entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. So whoever has got control of Gibraltar can control who goes into and comes out of the Mediterranean. And this had been captured by the British back in 1703 in the reign of William and Mary. And the British held on to it ever since and fought an incredibly tenacious battle to hold on to it during the years 1779 to 83. So here's a painting commemorating the British success in resisting an attempt by France and Spain to take over Gibraltar in those years. So there we are. These events look a little more than a little bit, they look distinctly different when you think about them from the British point of view. Now I want to ask you another question. Did the British learn from their defeat in the American Revolutionary War? I mean, first of all, one thing to think about is this. Normally, when a big empire is defeated, it goes into decline, and world history gives us dozens of examples. But the British Empire didn't go into decline after the end of the American War, after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. It carried on getting bigger. And in fact, it was still getting bigger right into the 1920s after the First World War, before finally starting to dissolve itself after the Second World War in the late 1940s. And that itself suggests that the British did, in fact, learn some lessons from what had gone wrong in America. Now I'm going to introduce you to another very, very important event in world history, the Canadian Revolution. Yeah, do you remember when the Canadian Revolution was? No, because it didn't happen. Anyway, there wasn't a Canadian Revolution. And of course, and the reason there wasn't, is because the British remembered. And so by about the mid-1830s, as more and more people were living in Canada, as it was kind of growing to political maturity, Canadians started to say, we ought to have more autonomy, we ought to have more self-government. The British sent out a royal commission to investigate, and they agreed, yes, that's right, we agree to the principle of Canadian self-government. So first within the various provinces, Ontario and Quebec and Newfoundland and so on, they gave it limited self-government. And then in 1867, just 2 years after the end of the American Civil War, they gave full self-government to Canada. And in return, Canada remained part of the British, a self-governing part of the British Empire, the Dominion of Canada, with the Queen, or King or Queen, as its head of state, right into our lifetimes, until very, very recently. And with the result, of course, that the misery and horror and bloodshed and waste of a revolutionary war was avoided. Now I'm going to tell you about another very, very important event, the Australian Revolution. Have you heard of that? No. Why? There wasn't one. I won't try that joke a third time. 2 is plenty. Same thing. I mean, Australia started out as a British prison colony. And incidentally, the first shipment of British prisoners went to Australia in 1788 because Britain could no longer ship its convicts off to become indentured servants in America, because America was now self-governing. Anyway, Australian history is also totally fascinating. But by about 1900, the British again realized Australia has now reached the point where it's capable of self-government. And before it comes to a crisis, we should grant it. And they did, with the result that Australia also stayed as one of the dominions of the British Empire. So I think that's interesting to see the way in which the British, having taken a very uncompromising approach at the time of the American War, took a far more conciliatory approach when some of the rest of its colonies reached political adulthood. Now, another very surprising and, to me, delightful story is this, that normally when one empire defeats another, they remain bitter enemies into the indefinite future. But that certainly wasn't true in the case of Britain and America. Very rapidly, even by the 1790s, in many ways, they were friends and allies again. Think about this, that it was in the late 1700s that the British Industrial Revolution was really firing up. It started out in cotton textiles, making cotton thread and and then weaving it into cotton fabric in factories which could do it far more cheaply and far better than hand spinners and hand weavers. But the British climate is far too cold for growing cotton. The cotton came from America, particularly from slave plantations in the American South. So almost at once, there was a very, very close commercial synergy, we would call it, in which cotton is grown in the American South, shipped across the ocean to Britain, taken to Liverpool and Manchester and the English textile towns of the English North, and converted into cloth. Very, very profitable business. Right through from then until the American Civil War of the 1860s, which cut off the trade and forced Britain to start looking somewhere else for cotton, particularly to Egypt and India. Now, here's another way in which the two countries very quickly reconciled with each other. The man on the top left is Sir Walter Scott. And if you said to Americans in 1800, who's the best novelist in the world? Most of them would say, oh, Walter Scott. Walter Scott, even though he was a British author, his novels were incredibly popular on this side of the Atlantic. People just loved Walter Scott. If he, in 1830, who's the greatest novelist? Charles Dickens. Yeah, there's Charles Dickens, the second picture. Now, Charles Dickens used to publish his novels in installments in a magazine, Household Words. And so he'd write a bit of the story, and then he'd leave it at a very dramatic moment. And then you'd have to wait a month before you find out what happened. Obviously, TV shows still do that, don't they? Week by week, you have to wait and see what happened. And there's a famous story that one of Dickens's novels called The Old Curiosity Shop. And there's a little girl, a lovely little girl called Little Nell. And she's one of those kids, she's kind of almost too good to be true. Anyway, she gets sick. And at the end of one episode, Dickens leaves her very ill. So everyone in America had to wait for a month until the ships arrived from England, bringing the next episode. And as soon as the ships came onto the horizon, people actually rowed their boats out into Boston Harbor. And people on the boats called up to the captain of the ship, "Is Little Nell all right?" The captain shouted, "No, she's died." And people raised black flags on the boats, and the church bells rang in Boston. For a fictional character, a fictional character created by an English novelist. Now, at the same time, American writers started to become very popular in England. famously, Frederick Douglass, I'm sure many of you know the story. He was born as a slave in Maryland. When he was about 18, he escaped to the north and he became a leading abolitionist, a brilliant, brilliant, spellbinding speaker. You know, he could speak for 2 hours and at the end of it, people would say, give us more. And a great writer as well. He wrote a brilliant autobiography, which is also a terrific attack on American slavery. And then the fourth one is Harriet Beecher Stowe, published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, an incredible bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic. She went to England and went on a tour. Queen Victoria invited her for tea and said, oh, my heart was in my mouth as I read about, you know, the characters. So there we are, sort of very lively kind of intellectual interchange between the two countries. And this culminated in World War I, when the British and the Americans were fighting on the same side. I mean, we're familiar, I think everyone in this room has got vivid memories of the incredible strength of the Anglo-American alliance, particularly during World War II and afterwards. But of course, in 1917, when the Americans joined World War I, it was still a little bit strange and unusual. So the one on the right there shows Uncle Sam with the eagle and Britannia with the lion, and now they're united. So they've got this history of being at each other's throats in the revolution, but now they're friends, and together they're beating the Kaiser's Germany. I'd like to finish with this picture, because this shows Winston Churchill giving a speech to a joint session of Congress. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Churchill went across the Atlantic. Churchill was the British Prime Minister. He went across the Atlantic and spent Christmas week at the White House with Franklin Roosevelt. Can you imagine America and the British Emperor all being run from the White House? You know, these two massive egotistical figures together. And Churchill was invited to address a joint session of Congress. And he began by saying, I'm the living embodiment of the Anglo-American friendship. My father was English, my mother was American. And I can't help thinking that if it had been the other way around, if my father had been American and my mother English, I'd have been an elected member of this body. You know, so he makes this little joke about how he would have been a US senator. And obviously this was the beginning of another episode of intense Anglo-American friendship. So there we are. I'd love to have your questions and your thoughts about what I've told you today. And that's a very, very quick outline of 3 centuries of Anglo-American history. Thanks so much. Yes.
Very good job. When did Australia become self-governing?
I think it was 1901.
1901.
Yeah, it's about 125 years ago now. And it was made up of several different provinces, each of which was more or less self-governing. But then they were consolidated into one nation, just like Canada in 1867. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question about Barbados. You didn't mention Barbados too much, but if I've got my ancestry right, my ancestors came from England, went to Barbados, and came to America. But I was curious to know what was going on with Barbados about that time during the American Revolution.
Yeah, Barbados was another of the English sugar colonies. And I mean, the thing that's hard to remember for us is that when we think of the Caribbean islands today, we think of them as vacation places, don't we? And many of them are tiny. Places like Guadeloupe and Martinique and Barbados are not very big. But nevertheless, the crop they grew, sugar, was incredibly valuable. Let me give you an example. Back in one of the earlier wars, the war which ended in 1748, in the treaty, Britain had the chance to take over the whole of Canada then, but instead they traded it for one little sugar island, which is about 50 square miles, because the whole of Canada seemed less valuable than this one island. Now, I mentioned briefly that the Americans hoped that the islands would join in the war, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't was because they were afraid of slave rebellions. Yeah, their view was, we need to have the support of the British Army and the British Navy, because if it comes to a slave rebellion, we, the whites, are outnumbered and will be overwhelmed. Whereas in America, although particularly in South Carolina, there was a majority, I think, or maybe 50-50 split between whites and blacks, the white Americans were more confident of their ability to prevail than the whites on the islands were. Yes.
Who was the woman on the previous bullet Frederick Douglass?
The previous slide.
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Oh, sorry, yeah. This one.
Yes.
Yeah, this one. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's a fascinating lady. Her husband, her father was what's his name? Charles Beecher. He was a kind of implacable Puritan minister. He's one of the last of the absolutely unflinching Puritans. To give you an example of what her father was like, she got an older sister, Catherine Beecher. And when Catherine Beecher's husband was killed in a shipwreck, the father said to his daughter, she's down to eternal hell because she didn't have a conversion experience, because she didn't have a conversion experience. Yeah. So later generations of the Beecher family were a bit more understanding. She was married to a man called Calvin Stowe, who was a preacher in Cincinnati in the days when Cincinnati was a border town, and it was on the Ohio River, which was the front line of the Underground Railroad. And she was involved in it. Her family helped escaping slaves to avoid the fugitive slave law and get them safely into New England or into Canada. And then she wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a terrific book, by the way. I mean, obviously the phrase Uncle Tom now means something irksome, but the book itself is absolutely electrifying. And once you've reached about page 20, you simply can't stop reading it. Yeah, and it's interesting because all the other books she wrote are terrible. And she herself said, I felt that God had taken hold of me. And just, he dictated the story. It's very sentimental, kind of cloyingly sentimental, but somehow you don't mind, you read it anyway. But she was never able to repeat this amazing success. Yeah.
Why did you say that the England declared, this board slavery? Why did they stop doing slavery in England?
Well, there was never slavery in England. So English people were very heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade.
Okay.
A lot of English merchants and captains grew very wealthy trading slaves from Africa to America and to the islands. But on English soil itself, slavery had got no judicial standing at all. But the shock was, I think what had been happening is that it was common for Americans to come to England with their slaves, and nobody would say a thing about it. But then once the abolitionist movement started, these very indignant, I say they were mainly Quakers or evangelical Christians, started saying, this is a moral wrong. When you go back to the year 1700, nobody was saying that. But by the 1770s, they were. Okay. And so it was because these abolitionists sued on Somerset's behalf that they were able to set him free. And even Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice who wrote the decision, said, I can hardly believe I'm doing this, but nevertheless I am, making it absolutely clear. He was obviously fully aware that slavery was central to the workings of the British Empire. But he said, here in England, it's not permitted. Okay.
Did they still have indentured servants though in 1790?
Yes, it was common. If you were poor and hopeless in England, and there were a lot of people who were like that, you could go to England, and if you could survive for 5 years working as in effect, as a temporary slave, then you'd be set free once you fulfilled your indenture. And then you could get a bit of land and you could start your own tobacco or indigo or rice, depending on where you were. In fact, weirdly, Georgia, where we are today, obviously, when it began, it had a rule against slavery. Started in 1733, I think it was. And its original charter said, we're going to have indentured servants, but we're not going to have slaves. That rule fell out of use within 5 years. It didn't last. But at least that was the initial assertion.
Overthrow, he wanted to be able to control the people that are there. He didn't want them to ban
so.
out.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Americans regarded slavery as a curse. When you read Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson was himself a slave owner. And he never freed his slaves. He really couldn't because he was always in debt and they counted as property. But he often, I mean, he wrote often, what a dreadful thing this is. You know, when I think there's a just God in heaven, I tremble at the thought of all this. And so, and in fact, some of the American revolutionaries said, one of the many terrible things George III has done is that they've kind of stuck slavery onto us. And now what are we going to do? This idea that it was really someone else's fault. I mean, that was a very, very weak argument for them to make, obviously. But they tried it. Oh, follow up, yes.
I've never been to England, so I wouldn't know. But in your opinion, are Black people being treated better in England today than they are in America, United States?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think so, yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I mean, the thing about Britain is it's got a very, very comprehensive welfare state, which means that anybody who's a citizen of Britain, and now a lot of Black and Indian and Pakistani people are British citizens, the state takes good care of them. And so there's far less severe poverty in Britain than there is here in America. So certainly in that sense. And I think also interracial attitudes are very good, that you often meet interracial groups of friends, which is still relatively uncommon here, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Kind of, yeah.
Over there.
Especially in some parts.
Yeah, obviously.
Real segregated.
They don't got no.
A lady in the back, go ahead.
Know about this being anyway a proper question, but could you talk about what
Like this. It's like
types of American expansion? Weren't the Americans expanding militarily where they were supposed to be?
You mean towards the west?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
And about the taxes
They're not spread.
that America was paying, wasn't that to kind of offset some of the expenses that the colonies themselves were incurring?
Yes, I'll go back to the front and answer the question. And this is about another aspect of the causes of the American Revolution, which I didn't say very much. But in 1763, when the French and Indian War finished, the great Anglo-French War, which preceded the Revolution, one of the things the British government did was to create a line called the Proclamation Line, and it was along the top of the Appalachian Mountains. And it said to the American colonists, you can't go beyond that line. And the reason they said it was because that's where the Native Americans lived. And they knew that the more settlers went across the line, the more friction there would be between the settlers and the Indians. And that then the British army would have to be called in to try to settle it. And that to pay a big army to garrison the frontier was expensive. And so the British also said, it cost us a lot of money to defeat the French. It cost us a lot of money to police the frontier. One of the things we're going to ask you Americans to do is to contribute to paying for it. I mean, to the British government, this just seemed blindingly obvious. Of course they're going to have to pay taxes. Americans paid something like a 20th as much as British people in taxes in the 1760s and 70s. But they were bitterly resentful of being asked to pay anything. And obviously that's why the Stamp Act crisis and these various other crises of the 60s and 70s blew up in their face. And so it's very interesting. When you read the declarations of the Stamp Act crisis in New York in 1765, they say this is part of a sinister plot by the king to squeeze the liberty out of Americans. Whereas in England, the Stamp Act went through Parliament. You know, hardly anyone even thought of challenging it. It seemed so mild and so reasonable. So gradually, the two sides sort of moved apart. But as you say, this point about the Proclamation Line was very important because it was a source of constant annoyance to Americans who'd hoped to be able to cross the mountains and make a fortune in land speculation. This is the time of people like Daniel Boone, you know, exploring into Kentucky and seizing land, which had previously been the land of the Shawnees and the Cherokees.
Can you touch on the people of Canada when the British started moving them out of Canada because they wanted the property that they had for the war?
Well, there were Native Americans living obviously in what's now Canada and what's now the United States. And settlers had been constantly in conflict with them. But they'd also often, there'd been long periods, obviously, of coexistence. I mean, between the first settlements in the early 1600s and the American Revolution in the late 1700s, there'd been 150 years of cooperation. A lot of French missionaries had gone to try to convert the Indians to Christianity. And French fur traders went and actually intermarried into the Indian tribes, because it was only by being related to someone that you could set up trading relations. The Europeans brought the guns that the Indians wanted. And of course, the furs, which the Indians provided, were a valuable trade commodity. But the difference is that far fewer French people went to Canada than English people went to America. I mean, at the time of the Revolution, there were still only, I think, about 100,000 French people in Canada, whereas there were 2.5 million American colonists in the 13 colonies. So there was a sharp difference. Is that?
Well, I've read where the British went in and just took over little towns and settlements and relocated them to Middle
Yes.
Virginia and into New Orleans, because they wanted that property that was right there at the.
Oh, that's right. Yes, in 1763, after the defeat of the French, they forcibly removed some of the populations. That's right. So that the Cajun people of Louisiana descended from French settlers in French Canada, as it had been. That's right. Yeah, go ahead.
What exactly happened with King George III? And it was interesting to hear, like in his older age, like he had lost his mind, he was mentally assassinated. So during the American Revolution, he wasn't crazy old King George, but did he, what happened to him?
Well, that's right. He remained, because I started out talking about him and then kind of drifted away from the king, didn't I? So let me just come back for a moment. Yeah, he was king right through until 1820. And so he was, at the time, the longest reigning king in English history, but then he was kind of beaten in longevity, first by Queen Victoria, then by Elizabeth II. But yes, he had periods of insanity. And historians now think he got bipolar disorder, but obviously we're not sure because we didn't have the
So
diagnostic.
like during the War of 1812, that was at the tail end, he was.
Exactly. As he grew older, these episodes became more frequent. And I mean, one of the terrible things is that he knew it was happening to him. You know, he'd say to his advisors, I can tell I'm descending into another fit of madness. And, you know, the treatment of mentally ill people in those days was incredibly brutal. They were put into straitjackets and thrown into a cell. And he more or less consented to this being done to him. But then he'd emerge again and he'd have periods of lucidity. And he had the pleasure, I suppose that's a funny way of saying it, but he had the gratification of witnessing the rise and fall of Napoleon. See, no sooner had the American Revolution finished than the French one began. The French Revolution led to the rise of Napoleon, but eventually the defeat of Napoleon, who was defeated once and for all at Waterloo in 1815, and he was still on the throne then. You know, he died in 1820.
They don't know what caused his mental illness.
No, I mean, the medical historians love this stuff. I once went to a medical history conference. They were super doctors, but they were terrible historians, you know, because they were sort of stabbing in the dark, really trying to make a guess at exactly what had happened to him. Yeah, we're not sure. Sir, at the back.
Was George III king during the War of 1812?
Yes, he was, but that's one of those periods when he was incapacitated by mental illness. And so his son, who was likely going to become King George IV, was the regent. That is, the most senior member of the royal family stood in for the king because the king was incapacitated.
When did the mental illness start and what is it called?
Well, they're not sure. At the time, it was just called madness because obviously they didn't have the sophisticated mental diagnosis that we use today. But as I mentioned, people think it was probably bipolar disorder, but they're not certain. And then somebody says it's a disease called porphyria, but they're not certain. So this is one of those areas we're simply not sure.
Porphyria?
Yeah. Yeah. Go on.
Mentally ill to Georgia, the prisoner.
I take the prisoners, but I don't think they're mentally ill. Not sure about. I
Like old door, I mean, for history, for that. Yes, I'd like to hear. I'm great praise.
prefer to know enough about it to be able to say.
They will leave on.
Do we have one more question? No. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.